today's topic is elves. And
Oh,
I feel like elves is a much wider topic than dwarves because not only
it's
do they have like the subclasses, but I feel like there's just different iterations of elves. You have like the drow. We
right.
talked about the Durgar for dwarves, but we have the
Right,
drow for elves, and then
right.
there's like the wood elf and the
The
high
high
elves.
elves, wood
And
elves,
then
and
from
there's the
those, now you have
Kai.
yeah, you have all the subclasses. Hey, Internet! Welcome to the sixth episode of The Game, Season 2. If you're just joining us, we're a tabletop talk show and podcast brought to you by Dungeon Studios. We go beyond live play and talk about everything from session zeros to campaign heroes. And I've got Russell in the back just cheering us on.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm doing the international, not sign language version of what you're saying, basically.
I love it.
Like the
So,
Coke announcements.
today's topic, folks, I'm really interested to talk about this one. Last time we talked about dwarves, we mentioned we're going to be going through kind of the player's handbook and talking about some of these races or species in depth. So I think that it's kind of a bigger topic.
Yeah, in fact, it's such a big topic that in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, Chapter 2 is dedicated to the Elven diaspora.
Oh,
There's a whole chapter about elves,
wow.
which I always tell my players to read and they never do. But, hey, what can you say?
Nobody
It's a
likes homework.
It's a really good chapter, and it's actually really useful. There's so much in there that D&D players just generally ignore, and it's kind of sad because some of it's really quite beautiful.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't read it, so I will have to take a moment and read through. I should have done it before we started recording.
That's all right. I mean, you've got your own notes, and I can throw in some stuff from here. But yeah, so we've got
So
lots of different types of elves.
right. And that's what I was going to say is maybe we should start with like, what are
What
elves? And this isn't
elves?
talking about going back into the history and the origin and everything, but just like when you say elf, what is everybody thinking of?
What
Right.
does that bring to mind? Right. I mean,
Right.
generally, either tall, slender, Lord of the Rings kind of elves,
Yeah.
sprites, right?
You're right. You're right. I think about that too. I also think about like Santa Claus and his elves, which are not
Yes,
quite sprites,
they're
but
gnomes.
yeah, they're pretty much gnomes.
They're pretty much gnomes. I mean, D&D gnomes anyway, yeah.
Right.
So,
Right.
I suppose the word elf, it kind of conjures all kinds of fey beings, elven kind. So it's kind of it covers a wide, in real life anyway, it covers a fairly wide range of experiences,
Right.
you might say.
I feel like if you boil it, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I was going to say, whereas in D&D particularly, you've got very specific elves of this. That's what they are.
Right. I think they have more of a definition in D&D. I think you have to because of the game mechanics, but
Yeah,
yeah.
and there's a lot of lore in D&D regarding elves. Some of it is kind of vaguely based on things like Alfenheim and stuff from the Norse,
Hmm.
business, but it's generally kind of just intuited from general fantasy kind of tropes, Lord of the Rings and whatever else has been in pop culture for a while, which is
Yeah.
mostly seems to be where D&D mostly draws from as pop culture rather than myth, at
Right.
least nowadays. It used to be the
Nowadays.
yeah. So it's kind of fascinating, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I feel
elves
like
they're my favorite race in the D&D game for various reasons.
it's funny. I hadn't thought about it, but when I think back to all the characters I've played, I think the majority of them have been some version of elf, and I didn't even realize that until I started thinking back. So I don't know if unconsciously they're my favorite.
Right, right. I mean,
But
I like some of the other races too. And the thing is, as a DM, thankfully I get to play everyone. So I get to be elves and halflings and dwarves and goblins and whatever the hell else. But as a player, you kind of, okay, we're going to play this campaign for 3 years. This
yeah,
is going to be your character for 3 years. Do you really want to play a goblin?
yeah,
And so from my point of view, I prefer playing an elf.
yeah,
I can get
right.
into that over a longer period of time. It's a
For
more
the long haul.
yeah. And the thing about elves too is there's a kind of tone about elves that's quite serious as well. I tend to think of them as being generally, especially high elves, sort of serene and above the sort of low emotions of other creatures. They don't get rocked as easily.
Right. Kind of like almost like a demigod or something in that sense.
Yeah, I mean they can be quite ancient, and I mean,
Yeah.
as I said in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, in this chapter, the Elven diaspora, they go on about how they raise their children, and there's some really important things in there, like the reverie is something that nobody talks about in D&D, and it's so crucial to elves. It's the
Really?
core of their whole culture, and everyone just you don't even know what it is, do you?
I don't. I
You
don't.
don't. See,
Yeah.
that's the
See,
thing.
I should have read this book.
Right. So when the elves meditate, because they only have to sleep, or they don't have to sleep at all, they can meditate for 4 hours and have a long rest, right? But when
Right.
they're meditating, they experience this thing called the reverie. And the reverie is essentially where your character's mind goes back to past lives, and you experiencing your soul's past over centuries or even thousands of years, going all the way back to the primal elves, all the way back to
Wow.
or all the way back to Corellon. And so there's this kind of waking sense of being all of those individuals. So elves carry with them a huge weight of history.
Wow.
That players kind of just, yes, I'm going to be an elf. I would like to steal that loaf of bread. It's like,
Yeah.
well, that's very mundane. But, meanwhile, you just had this reverie 20 minutes ago when you was resting about being blah, blah, where and when. But,
Yeah.
I'm trying to bring across my personal point of view.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it
That's
goes
pretty
into
cool. I'll have to look into that. I mean, already. So let's take a step back for a second, because
yeah,
I think this leads into, so what I think most people think of when we think of elves is, the Tolkien, long, slender, pointy ears, like you said, long
right.
lives, definitely
Legolas,
magical, or highly skilled or very magical.
right.
And
Thinking of Elrond or Gladriel or what was it?
exactly.
Yeah,
And they have long lives
yeah.
that at least according, and so I don't know, I never would have really thought about the fact that they would also have a connection to their ancestry when they already are so long lived.
Right,
Like,
right.
what does that even like then?
Well, it's curious. I mean, I know I talk about Matt Colville a lot. He said, in his opinion, he thinks that elves should not be player characters. He thinks they're too mystical. They're
Too
too
mystical.
magical,
Yeah.
too removed, too alien to be player characters.
Yeah.
I mean, he lets it happen. He does do that, but he's sort of in his own mind.
Mhm.
That's how he would run it if it was up to him.
Yeah.
I'm not completely against that idea, but that being said, I actually prefer. I really want to play a campaign where everyone's playing elves, and we get into the history of the elves, and we get into the culture of the elves, and we actually bring all that stuff out. Because I mean, I know we love playing diverse groups of players, but there's a lot to be said for putting a bunch of characters together who are actually quite similar in some way and have a history and background together, so that you can explore as a group a much deeper role-playing experience.
Yeah.
Connections to each other that you don't get from a bunch of mercenaries who met in a tavern.
It actually, doing that sounds very similar to the way you've talked about your vampire games and how they are so long lived and they have these long lineages, and it almost sounds like that kind of experience, which I don't think I've experienced in a D&D game.
Yeah, I think that's why I like elves so much, because they are very similar to vampires. I mean, obviously, if you believe in alignment, they're quite different. But
right.
I mean, that being said, you've got your drow elves and blah blah blah. Kryn has dark elves; they don't have drow.
Yeah.
So lots of interesting things going on with elves. Of course, we've got the Aladrin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to say, let's talk about this since you already are bringing this up. I mean, aside from the high elf, wood elf, and dark elf, right? Then we have all these subraces, which there's like a million of them, it seems. But go ahead. So what? Let's talk about Eladrin. Like, what are Eladrin? Like, what are the differences?
Okay, well, all right. So you've got your wood elves and your high elves, and everyone's pretty familiar with that. And to me, the Eladrin are kind of to high elves what high elves are to wood elves. They're like the even higher elves. No, I'm kidding. And at the same time, they're kind of not, because they can be more or less civilized because they're very primal. They're connected to the seasons, the Eladrin. And in fact, as an Eladrin character, a player character, you can change your season with a long rest.
Oh, that's cool. I haven't
Yeah.
played one.
Yeah, no, they're very cool. I mean, they're not super min-maxed. They're not great mechanically for combat-y type stuff necessarily. They're okay. If you tailor it correctly, it's good.
Right.
But you've got your autumn, winter, spring, and summer Eladrin, and they can change. And each, depending on which one you are, your Misty Step ability, whatever it's called, it's not always Misty Step. They change the name depending, but it's basically Misty Step.
Right.
It has a different effect when you do it. So if you're, I think it's like the winter, for example, if you're in your winter form, when you phase step, one creature of your choice that you can see within 5 feet of you before you teleport has to make a wisdom save or be frightened.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
you teleport out, whoop, and the person's frightened. The Spring Eladrin, when you use phase step, what is it? That you
Which one?
touch a creature.
Oh.
You can touch a creature and teleport them instead of you.
Oh, I like that.
Right. The Summer Eladrin, the person takes fire damage equal to your charisma modifier, and the Autumn Eladrin charms the person that they phase step away from.
Yeah.
So you've got all these different types of. Oh, and we've got sea elves too. Let's not forget the sea elves.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Actually, Dragonlance, in my opinion, has some of the most interesting elves. You've got like the Kaganesti elves and the Daganesti and all these different tribes. They've all got names and they're quite specific. But yeah, and then we have the Shadar Kai.
Yes.
And the Shadar Kai are kind of interesting because whilst technically they are elves, they're only barely elves. They've lived in the Shadowfell potentially for thousands of years. Every time they die, they're resurrected over time.
Right. See, to me, those are like the anti-elves, like if elves are fey and light and magic and whimsy, then like these are the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I did a campaign recently where the players went into the Shadowfell and had to deal with the Raven Queen, and one of the characters in particular was the center of this piece, and the other 3 players played Shadar Kai, servants of the Raven Queen, clerics of the Raven Queen, and they came and collected this player and then took him to the Fortress of Memories and then helped him through his tests. And as we did that, the Shadar Kai players then became NPCs in each of his visions.
Wow.
So they all played multiple characters except for Barry, who played his character, Milford Brixton.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean the Shadar Kai are pretty interesting. The first time I played one, I didn't really enjoy it, but yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say I want to put in a few clarifications for maybe folks who aren't even like familiar with dark elves and drow and the wood elf and the high elf, which are kind of like the 3 basic ones, right? Or beginning, whatever you want to call them, well-known ones. So cool. Because I can imagine that someone saying, what's the difference between a dark elf and a Shadar Kai? Right. Which dark elf, well, the coloring on a Shadar Kai is not, they have a different coloring, right?
Well, the Shadar Kai, in their own plane, in the Shadowfell, they appear to be undead.
Okay.
And so they're sort of falling apart. But in the real world, when they come to the material plane, they take on the form of an elf. I think that's how it works. Generally.
Right. Okay.
And the drow elves,
they have like dark skin.
In the lore, in D&D lore, they have dark skin and platinum hair.
Right.
Take Drizzt de Erden, for example. He's a perfect example.
Exactly.
In my personal game, in my campaign Sidarial, I have flipped that on its head and decided that dark elves or drow elves are in fact albino.
Okay.
Very white skin, white kind of eyes, no pigment. They still have white hair, but they look more like the dark elves from the Thor movies.
Right. Well, it almost makes sense for them to look the way that you're describing because of their sensitivity to light, which, it's like, how'd you get that tan?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it totally diffuses all of the bullshit about alignments and skin color as well. So
yeah.
That's another aspect of it. Not to say that, I personally think that any elf of any color is quite feasible and possible. And I mean, we've got humans of all different colors and hairs and dyes and stuff. Why not do that with elves? And that's reasonable.
Exactly.
But we do tend to think of elves as being kind of Western European in their look and style. And yet a lot of the time we take high elves and we're kind of stealing a whole bunch of Asian culture, actually.
Really? You think so?
I think so. Like in terms of the sort of zenness of the elves, the kind of...
Oh, I see that. Okay, yeah.
Their approach to life, their harmony, their choice of sort of harmonious, long view, sort of a long world view, if you like.
Yeah.
More in keeping with something like Confucianism.
Yeah, I can see that now. That makes sense to me. I like that. You're right, because when I first started looking into playing like my first elf, I was very confused about like what the heck are high elves versus all this other stuff. And someone pointed out to me, if you're looking at the Lord of the Rings movies and you're seeing the elven, city, and it's just so like glowing and beautiful and like you said, harmonious and peaceful, whereas wood elves to me are more like almost like what you would imagine a druid to be, a druid in any shape or form. Like to me, that's what wood elves are. And it was very confusing in the beginning to say like, what's the difference?
Right. I think that's a pretty
yeah,
good distinction.
yeah,
I would go a step further. I would say Legolas was probably a wood elf.
yeah. He seems more like a wood elf.
He's a wood elf ranger.
I mean, he doesn't have all the like pomp and circumstance that I would imagine like a high elf would have.
Exactly. I mean, like you compare him to Elrond or Gladriel.
Yes.
Very different characters.
Yeah.
And then you get in certain types of D&D. So I can't remember whether they have this in 5th edition, but there used to be a thing called a wild elf.
Oh, wow.
And they have them in Dragonlance too. And the wild elves are like barbarian tribes of elves.
Cool.
They live on the plains, or they live in villages, fishing villages, or whatever. And they're very, very low tech. Their magic is almost entirely nature magic, druids, rangers, that type of stuff. They don't really have wizards and sorcerers and clerics.
Yeah.
So there's the sort of wild elf distinction between, wood elves, wild elves, high elves, and then all your other types of elves. Because like Forgotten Realms has moon elves and sun elves as well. Which I like. They have that in World of Warcraft, which is quite cool.
Yeah, I've seen that also. There's a Netflix animated show called something Dragon Prince. I don't know if you've seen that. I can't think of the whole name of it. Sorry, folks. But that one, they take a very interesting look at like one of the main characters. She's considered a moon elf.
Right.
And I think the way that they portray her character, she's kind of druidy, but kind of not. She's definitely stealthy and a rogue,
Right.
but the look and feel of the elves are different in that show, which I appreciate. And then the sun elves are really all about like fire magic. It's not, like the sun. It's more about like fire. Yeah. So
power,
it's really cool.
Right. Yeah. No, that is cool. The other thing we obviously haven't mentioned is elves tend to have pointy ears.
Yes. Very pointy ears, actually.
And it does depend, because of course you get everyone from half elves. And I can only talk about my own game because the way I describe elves, but the half elves have very slightly pointy ears. Yeah. Usually, because they're half elves, it could go either way. Actually, you could have a half elf that looks pretty much like an elf if you wanted to.
Right.
But to me, the wood elves and the high elves have relatively pointy ears, and then you get the Eladrin who have fucking huge floppy ears, like World of Warcraft night elves. I think they are.
Yeah.
I love that. Those huge sort of.
I mean, yeah, because once they get to a certain length, they can't possibly, like, unless they're made like super hard, like hard cartilage.
Right. It's not flopping.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do like that style of sort of very, very long pointy ears. Not obviously stupidly long, but yeah. And for me, that's what the Eladrin have. And I think that like the closer you get to the primal elves in terms of bloodlines, the more pointy your ears get.
Yeah. I would think so. That makes sense to me.
Right, exactly.
I wonder what about like, is there a description with sea elves? Like I'm curious how you would interpret what their ears should look like.
Well, I mean, I think sea elves have relatively smallish. I mean, I'm actually looking at a picture of a sea elf now fighting a Sahugin. And they've got quite pointy ears in this picture, but not the longest, but still kind of there.
Right. Okay.
That kind of length.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what about these? I had never come across this in any of the D&D lore that I've encountered, but there are apparently winged elves, Averial, winged elves capable of flight, rare and reclusive, embodying grace and freedom. But I don't know.
I have to say, I think I have come across that name and maybe even that description, but it hasn't been for a long time, and I don't remember anything about them. Which world are they from? Are they from a particular D&D campaign setting?
I'm going to look at that right now. I just assumed, because you're the guy who knows a lot of this stuff, I was like, oh, looks like Forgotten Realms.
Forgotten Realms. Well, that makes sense. I mean, Forgotten Realms is kind of the melting pot of all D&D, isn't it?
Right.
From what I can tell. It's the sort of default everything goes world.
But yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they look like winged people,
Right. So what's the difference between that and what do you call them? The celestial race, not Kalos.
Asimar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They sound a lot like Asimar, but with pointy ears.
Right, right. I don't know. That's a very good question. Let's see. It's probably boils down to mechanics, but let's see. And Faerun. Yeah. It's a good question. Maybe we'll, when we get to Asimar,
Yeah.
however people pronounce it, we will compare the differences.
Indeed. That sounds fascinating. I mean, the topic of elves is a very broad one, and we're talking about it very generally from the point of view of D&D players primarily.
Right.
And so there's a lot to take in with that. I mean, if you're choosing to play an elf, the easy way is to say, well, I'm an orphan, and I don't know anything about my culture, so I'm just play a human, however the hell I want, with pointy ears and a few extra traits.
Right.
That's the easy way. The hard way is to do a bunch of research and actually find out what elves are like in the world that you're playing in, and try and sort of
align with that.
Yeah, align with that. I mean, depending on your DM, because take, for example, in my world, I've got like tables of lineages and family lines and all of their emblems and stuff like that, for all these elven lines, and as well as like the royal lines and stuff like that. And it all ties in very much to the history of the world that I've created, because that world was originally created for the elves, actually. In that case. So depending on your DM, you might have really specific stuff, or they might not give it a damn. They might be like, yay, do whatever you want. That's cool.
Right.
And if exploit that. But if you're playing with me, there are guidelines for playing elves. And, if you don't like that, well, there are other DMs.
And there are other DMs. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. That's a good point. I mean, because I think a lot of people nowadays have this kind of notion, like we've talked about this in the past, like, I want to play a goblin that does this and this and this. Well, then, but what is it about being a goblin that makes you want to play a goblin? Otherwise, why don't you just play a halfling and do all the same stuff, right? So exactly. Very similarly, it's like, well, if you want to play an elf that does this and then this, you need to kind of understand how that works within the world that you will be playing in. Otherwise, it might not make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's unfair to the sort of ongoing story, if you like, when you come along and sort of, let's say this campaign setting has existed for 5 years, and then you come along and you're like, I'm just going to do this other thing and derail the story, the theme. Basically, it's blowing holes in somebody's world.
Right.
So,
right.
Careful.
So, we were talking before about some examples. A lot of them all came from Lord of the Rings, right? Or we're talking about Drizzt. I have such trouble saying that name. We talked about Santa and his elves, which we both, I think, agree are not quite our idea of elves. Nice. And one of the things, it's not actually called out in the lore, but like Legend of Zelda and Link, like they give him pointy ears. They dress him in green, like leathers and stuff. And you're like, he's an elf, right? He seems like an elf. And they have like, and even Zelda herself looks like an elven princess. So they don't actually say it, but I'm curious what other folks think about that.
Right. I mean, it seems to me like they're just sort of using those tropes, just not generally labeling them, so they
just not calling it out.
Yeah, that would make some sense, wouldn't it?
Right. But so what I find very interesting, because we've talked also with dwarves about like going back to the real history and the origin, because there's so much fascinating stuff there that nowadays we don't even kind of get exposed to that anymore. Like with D&D, we have this very defined idea of what elves are, right? But if you look back into the history, the origin, like it is wild to me, some of the stuff that I found what was one of the funniest things? Oh my gosh, it was so there was this kind of mythos around things that are called elf circles. Do you know anything about this?
This is not D&D, is it?
No, this is real life.
Are we talking about elf circles are like fairy circles? Is that kind of the same thing?
I don't know what a fairy circle is, so I only just heard about elf circles today.
Stories about children wandering off in the woods, finding a circle of flowers, wandering into it and disappearing forever.
Potentially there might be some connection to that. So what I found was that elf circles, elven women, it was said that elven women would dance at night, and when they danced, they would leave these shapes on the ground, these circles, right?
Oh, like crop circles.
And then strange things could happen when you're in the circle, or if you do anything with the circle. Usually it was like bad luck to step on them. However, I came across this one little myth about it, that if you were to urinate on an elf circle, it would cure your sexually transmitted disease.
Wow.
It's bad luck to step on it, but pee on it all you like.
Pee on it all you like. That's great. Yeah. The elves like your urine, especially if it's STD ridden.
Yeah. There was another one related to the circles that was like, if you happen to cross elves dancing at night and you watched them, it would feel like you were watching them for like an hour or two, but really you lost like a year or two of your life.
Right. Yeah. Very Feywild kind of.
Very Feywild kind of connotations.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's the other thing with the Eladrin, which I didn't actually mention, and I think that's probably super important, is the Eladrin come from the Feywild, right? That's their habitat. That's where they come from. And so if you see an Eladrin in another plane or in the material plane, they are less likely to have come from that plane. They might have, but they probably came from the Feywild. And obviously the Feywild is a sort of world of passion and Fey stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's why I feel like the Eladrin elves are almost like more pure elves. They're closer to the source, closer to the primal elves,
right?
Closer to Corellon and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. I mean, because they say, at least in the D&D lore, that like if you're Elven, you pretty much have Fey ancestry. It's tied into like the game mechanics as well.
Yeah,
so
but put to sleep, don't need to sleep properly,
right,
can't be charmed as easily.
It's one thing like for me to have Filipino ancestry and be here in America versus have Filipino ancestry and be in the Philippines. Right, it's a very different thing.
Yeah,
sure. That's pretty cool.
That makes perfect sense. Now, the other thing, of course, about the elves is they're very religious, at least in D&D. And their religion's tied directly into their sort of creation. And I think, a lot of people sort of ignore this again about elves, but if you go into the D&D lore properly, or deeply, you got Corellon the Rathian and the Seldarine, who are that's the name of the whole pantheon of elven gods, the Seldarine. So it's Corellon and Sehanine Moonbow and Aralith and all the other deities of the Seldarine. And they created the primal elves. In fact, they were the primal elves. Corellon was the creator, and then they had several generations. Right. And so at some point, when they left Arvindor, in my opinion, they kind of stopped being primal elves and they started producing lesser elves, if you like, outside of that. And that fact that they're descended from these primal elves who come from Corellon the Rathian, the god of the elves, the king of the gods of the elves, combined with the sense that they have this reverie thing that they do with their meditations, and their deep connection to that suggests that their religion, their gods are very real to them because they're descended from them, and they can even remember them in their reverie. They might not remember
the reverie. Going back to that is like, how can you forget your history if you have that ability?
Right. Now, maybe, we had a game in Vaingate where one of the player characters did not know how to achieve reverie, had not been trained to do those meditations, and had never had any formal training from his elven, kin, because he was brought up separately in a special place. And so we had one of the other players teaching him how to do the reverie. And so it was kind of interesting as he was unlocking this ability and this knowledge of himself.
Yeah.
Over the course of the campaign. It wasn't just an instant thing either,
what I love about the reverie too is like, as far as role play goes, characters can use that, when you level up and then you get this cool new ability, and like narratively it's like, how do you explain that you have this new ability? But now you can kind of go back to the reverie and be like, oh, this knowledge was imparted to me, and that is so cool.
And that works really well unless you're a human or anybody else, basically.
Yeah.
But it works great for elves.
I was going to say, we're talking about elves. We don't care about anybody else right now.
Right. Exactly. Did you know that like Blade Singers, the Blade song, seems to come from a sort of elven background too.
No.
Just having a look here. Few among the elves, and even smaller number of elves, have the honor of being inducted into the ranks of the blade singers. One must have the mind necessary to be a great wizard, and also the agility of the greatest of dancers. But yeah, it seems like it's at least an elven tradition, if not created by the elves. I wouldn't be surprised. Another thing we should probably talk about is the elven high magic.
Yeah. They're kind of meant for magic, aren't they?
Yeah, well, high elves. I mean, typically in the old D&D have always had sort of higher intelligence, and the wood elves are a bit more kind of dexty, possibly
Yes.
dexty, in that way. But certainly the high elves in Toril, in Forgotten Realms, in their lore, had this very powerful high magic, which has been forgotten. Like, as you probably know, D&D spells go up to level 9, right? They used to go before that, many, many, many aeons before player characters existed. They went up to like level 12.
I thought you were going to say 11.
Right. Yeah, all the way to turn it up to 11. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, they did that, and then they went one more. They went to 12. And the thing about the spells and magic that's beyond that level, first of all, it's been restricted by the goddess of magic, I think, Mistra, I think. I might be wrong. So no one can cast anything higher than a 9th level spell now. But before that, when they could, the elves could get together and cast spells as a group. And I have to say, I really love this, and I think it should be a mechanic in D&D. I think I think the idea of people casting spells together as rituals, or even just working together to cast spells, should be able to, you should be able to share spell slots or something like that, or empower other people's spells with your magic. But in any case, the high elves used to be able to create these amazing effects like floating cities that were essentially permanent. And you have this term mythal, mythal, a mythal. And a mythal is a magical construct created by a whole bunch of elves who gave their lives
Oh, wow.
to the mythal in order to create it. One example of a mythal is the one that's in, I want to say, Baldur's Gate. Could be wrong which city it is, but I think it's Baldur's Gate, where there's a mythal around there that stops, I think it's dragons from entering it.
Really?
Yeah, and so there's this bubble that nobody can see it, but it exists, and basic dragons can't enter it, and so it's permanent. The ancient civilizations of whomever they were, the Netherese, I want to say, in Toril, they had floating cities that used high magic to create in the same sort of way. But this art is lost in D&D now, and so you only have up to 9th level spells. But originally, it was elven high magic, and I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
The idea that you can have these ancient permanent sites around your world that have elven high magic infused in them that cannot be created is pretty cool. I have a couple of mythals in my world too, so
that's awesome.
Yeah,
I love that kind of stuff. Folks, I'm telling you, if you are ever lost for ideas, just digging into like the old, D&D lore, or just the old real world lore. Like, there's so much there that people just aren't exposed to, I think.
Right.
Like, and I'm in this stuff like 24/7, and yet I didn't know about that.
Right. I mean, same. You keep hitting me with things I wasn't really aware of either, like the winged elves.
Yeah.
I've been playing D&D since 1980.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we were talking about, you were talking about the high magic and high elves and stuff. Let's talk about then kind of I want to bring up, it's funny, I have this weird appreciation for min-max builds now that I never used to. Not that I play that way. I actually do not prefer to play that way, but I am learning that there's just kind of there are different styles of play, right? And some people really, really do enjoy this min-max build, and having conversations around like, why do you play that way versus why I have absolutely no care if I build something that is rotten. I don't care. I'm still going to have fun because I'm there for the role play, right?
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting having these conversations. And because of that, I feel like I have to represent the folks that aren't me and share, if you're going to build an elf, like, here's some min-max build stuff. So when you were talking about the high magic, right? I guess it really depends on, since there are so many different types of elves, it really depends the type of elf that you pick will kind of dictate some of these min-max options that I'm going to talk about here. If you pick an Eladrin, if you pick a high elf, that's probably all going to be magic and like, wizards. And
it kind of, I mean, if you're min-maxing, I don't know, my opinion is that when people min-max, they don't tend to say, I'm going to play an elf. How can I min-max an elf? They tend to say, I'm going to make a character that's different to everybody else in the group, and I'm going to min-max some kind of character that will fill the roles that doesn't exist in the group at the moment.
That's not the experience I have. The experience I have is someone goes, and usually it's because maybe they're not as experienced as, let's say, we are, but they've already created their character. They're already 5 levels in, and now it's time to level up, and they don't know what to pick, and I'm so confused. So they'll post on a forum and be like, I have this is my character. What the heck should I pick next? Here's my 3 options. And then they wait for people to kind of explain the why and how, and so that they are leveling up to their best ability.
I totally get that. I mean, Avery is a great example, actually. He's not what I call a typical min-maxer. He makes characters that are actually interesting and that he wants to play, and he starts from the point of view of his kind of personal aesthetics, I think. But then once he's got that character concept, he min-maxes the fuck out of it. And I don't blame him. I mean, if you're there's no point in not min-maxing to a degree, as long as it's your character. You don't have to go to ludicrous lengths, but don't make a character that's kind of just broken in the game, because it won't be as much fun. Even if you are a role player, all that stuff, you're not losing anything to make your character a little bit more min-maxed.
Right.
It's not going to hurt you. The only thing I really object to is when you see players that choose a character that has 4 intelligence and then they play them like geniuses.
Yeah.
Or they have 12 intelligence or even 9 intelligence and play them like they've only got 5 intelligence.
Right.
That kind of thing is a little bit frustrating, but
it can be.
I mean, you do kind of have to play what is on your sheet, but you don't have to be absolutely beholden to it.
Right.
You can deviate. A stupid character can once in a while come up with a smart idea.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're agreeing some level of min-maxing obviously is going to help, at least with the game mechanics and the battle mechanics and so forth, if not some of the role play.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes, it's a bit of both. I mean, I think the more that you play D&D and any role-playing game, there's a bit of both that happens. You learn more about role-playing and you learn more about the game system that you're using. And I think a lot of it's just got to do with familiarity. Yeah. I mean, if you're familiar with the system and all the feats and all of the classes and races and subraces and subclasses and fucking all that shit, once you're familiar with all those mechanics, it's a lot easier to pick and choose stuff that works for a character that you want to role-play.
Right.
And is mechanically sound, whereas if you're never played D&D before, you're like, I want to play an Elven Ranger. Okay. And you just put your stats wherever you want. And you don't even know all of the feats and shit. So you're like, you don't know what you can have and what you can't have. So you choose stuff that sounds good.
Right.
And you get players who stay like that forever because they never want to read the rules. They're not there for the mechanics. They just want to role play, for whatever reason. Yeah. You have players like that have played D&D for like 4 or 5 years now and never really read the player's handbook. Right. They just play characters. They make their characters and they play their characters, and that's what they want to do.
Yeah. I think in those cases, then what it is they don't know that there are other options besides D&D, and they just want to role play. But we digress. So let's get back into min-max builds, right? So as I was saying, high elves, eladrins, things of that nature. Choose spellcasters. Wood elves. Russell already mentioned wood elves are kind of dexterous and like probably rogues, rangers, monks,
possibly fighters.
Yeah, fighters. Yeah,
archers of some description. And one of the things, like I'm currently developing an elf subrace for my world. Yeah. And I'm kind of basing it on an idea between a wood elf and a wild elf. These are called Moonbrook elves because they come from a tribe called the Moonbrook tribe. And I want them to have the ability to do stuff like what Legolas could do, running across branches and leaping through trees and that type of stuff, being able to attack from above from a tree, ambushing people and, that type of stuff, being Mask of the Wild type things where they're practically invisible, but especially this idea that they're super dexterous and almost weightless sometimes, like
nice. So they could like the martial arts films where they can just stand on like the tip of a petal and the flower doesn't fall over.
Right, exactly. The willow branch just bends, but it doesn't break. Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I want to do with it. I'm still trying to figure out how to mechanically make that happen, but it's a fun thing. So yeah, different types of elves.
Yeah. So elves in general, okay, not just subraces, they do tend to get bonuses to their dexterity and intelligence. So as we were saying, yeah, rogues, rangers, wizards. And I would even say, I feel like because there's so many subclasses, there's so many options that multi-classing is like a real option here because you can really just fine tune the little things that you maybe you didn't get in your build, or you can expand upon what you did get. So multi-classing, I think, is a real option for elves.
That's for sure.
We were talking about the fact that they only need like 4 hours of sleep if you're playing an elf, right? Which I find
it's meditation.
Yeah, that's right. It's some kind of like a trance-like state, right?
Yeah,
I've actually used that a lot. My current my long time character that I've been playing that I talked about on the game last year. That ability has come in so handy because I tend to be one of the few characters that like everybody just rest. I'll take watch, no big deal. Like, yeah.
Exactly, because you can actually stay present mechanically you're allowed to make perception checks.
So it's been really helpful to have that. So just utilize any other like elf traits that you get. Like I said, lack of sleep for me means like I have more time in the evening to work on other things or to help my party out, or I just pile it on my character. And then there are feats that you can choose to help your elf. Elven accuracy, I haven't actually seen that one. I'll have to, maybe it's called something else, but I don't think I've ever actually taken that feat.
You have to be an elf to take it though, don't you? Obviously
must be, I guess. But it says
racial feats came out in Tasha. Was it Tasha?
I don't know.
Where did we get the racial feats from? I don't know. Anyway, okay.
And like you talked about the high magic, but there's also wood elf magic, which allows you to kind of like add spells. So if there's any feats that kind of tie into, how to increase all these special abilities that you get with being an elf, then lean towards those feats.
Right.
What else? Equip wisely. I don't know many elves that are like heavy armor, right?
So high elves can be. There's, for example, at least in my campaign, the Black Guards of Tularathian of full plate armor.
Nice.
Very scary looking kind of,
See, that's kind of what I did when I built my elf. So just so that I can stop calling her my elf. So her name's Mariel, right? Been playing her for 7 years now and still going. But when I built her, she's a wood elf. I started her as a fighter, and because I wanted the action surge and all that stuff, I wanted to have a dexterous build. I also wanted her to not be like super foo-foo magic boobies. Like I didn't want any of that. Like I just wanted a good solid fighter. And then through her backstory that I created, because I created like the most tragic backstory like everybody else does. Through the backstory, it kind of, when we started leveling up and I started thinking about multi-classing, my DM kind of threw this at me. There was a session where we hit my backstory and these frost giants showed up, and my character she went crazy and insane, and in her pursuit of vengeance before she met this party, she pretty much went to go hunt and kill all the frost giants in the world, right? And in my brain, I'm like, I show up, I meet this party, and I'm like, yeah, I'm the one who made frost giants extinct. Like I always thought that, but my character was always crazy. And my DM, of course, I didn't think about it, but my DM's like, there's no way that you actually killed all the frost giants. So the first time that my character encountered frost giants in the wild, I was like, what? And I Amber, went into a rage. And my DM was like, you know what? Your character goes into a rage, even though I wasn't a barbarian. And so after that, the next level up, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense to dip into barbarian. And now I've heavily leaned into it. But what's really cool is I have her as this dexterous build with these dual razored chains that I swing around, and then rage. And I'm like a blender coming at these things. And it is wild. It is so much fun. So just, it's sometimes unexpected stuff will come up with your elf. But I don't know anybody who's ever leaned in and said, yeah, I'm going to build an elf barbarian. Maybe.
I know one person in one of my campaigns is a multi-class barbarian rogue wood elf.
Really?
He's
Nice.
really good.
A barbarian rogue. That's pretty cool.
It's a really good build, actually.
Yeah.
He's quite formidable. Doesn't have the most hit points, does he? I don't remember. His name was Alcas. Anyway,
Yeah.
character had a sailor background.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so he was kind of interesting. So yeah, you can do it,
Yeah,
but
you can. I guess to me, I liked the idea that I was fighting against what I thought was a trope.
right.
And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, it certainly is a trope, and you did play against it. It's something that not many people do. So
Yeah.
good on you in that. I think, like, for me personally, if I'm going to play an elf, there's really sort of a couple of main options. I want to play either like a ranger elf,
Mm-hmm.
or I want to play like a paladin,
Mm.
elven paladin. I love that idea. I've never gotten to do it properly and actually role play a elven paladin. But then I'm really kind of simple and basic in this way. I love playing clean archetypes. Like, I don't really enjoy multi-classing so much.
Yeah.
I want to play the ultimate paladin elf. Like, I want to
Right.
be this thing.
I want to be the
That's
best paladin
the
ever.
best paladin elf. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my objective, is to play that concept purely,
Mm-hmm.
and without any I don't know, I guess it's like that there's a time in your life as an actor when you're ready to play King Lear,
Mm. Yeah.
and the role that you want to play. So it's a very specific role, but you have ideas about how you want to portray it. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably my main sort of ways to go with an elf. Or actually, an elven wizard's quite fun too.
Right. That's kind of, I think I'm trying to remember, because I told you that like a lot of the characters I've played have all been elves. I played an elven druid. I played an elven. My first one was a ranger. I created her as a ranger. Actually, she was a lot of fun. But that was so long ago, I barely remember it. And I think other than that, I played like a lizard folk druid. So I'm really getting ready. Like, I want to branch out and play other things. The problem is like the games that I play in, my DM, he runs long form campaigns. So I need to find some folks where I can play like a little one shot so I can try other things.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. I'm going to run some free one shots sometime this year.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in any of those.
Yeah, cool.
One of them I'll throw in a vampire one to keep you
Yeah.
get you into that. I should do that soon. Yeah.
So,
Anyway.
folks, this is a perfect little lead in real quick, since I mean, we're just kind of sort of in the middle of the conversation. Maybe we're about 3/4 through the conversation. Russell is a professional DM, and he has his own website, Rollstream. And if you want to hire him to run a game for you, or if you want to check out what his games look like, you can find him on YouTube. You can find him on his website.
We stream on Twitch.
Oh, and Twitch. Sorry.
We stream most of our games on Twitch. We play with D&D Beyond and Roll20 and Zoom mainly.
And if you want to see what Vampire the Masquerade is like, because, I don't see a lot of that on the internet these days. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and Amber also has a YouTube channel and various other social media vectors that you can follow. Her name there is usually Perty Nerdy, PERTY _ Is there an underscore
Nope.
usually?
No underscore, just pretty nerdy. It's pretty much everywhere. It's pretty nerdy.
Right.
Yeah.
With few exceptions.
Yeah. I like that you called out the T though, because I've had a couple folks say they searched for Purdy nerdy and they couldn't find me. So I was like, right. Oh no, yeah, Purdy nerdy. But on this subject of elves, I mentioned in our dwarves episode, I create little mood music videos, like lo-fi style music videos with world building prompts. I do have one for elves. So if you are building your world out, or you have an elven character and you just need a little inspiration to kind of give that a little more depth, then you can go to my channel and go to the elven music video, and then you have about 4 or 5 hours of just sitting there, and you can write and you can think, and if you lose your way, just check the screen and there's a prompt, and boom, now you've got more inspiration. So yeah, Elven. I'm gonna have to see what are we going to talk about next time, and then I'll have to create a video for that too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, we were talking before about classes and things that are great with elves. And my personal tastes, I like elven clerics, actually.
Yeah.
Because there's so much lore around elven religion.
That's true.
It's easy to assimilate that, and you get to have plate armor or heavy armor. You can smash things, and you can cast spells like a paladin. Better than a paladin, in fact. So elven clerics, lots of options, and there's a different cleric subclass for every type of elf that you might want to play. My wife at one point was playing a high elven cleric, trickster cleric, which is really powerful. Actually, trickster clerics are quite impressive, and I've never seen one played before. So, and nobody ever plays them. Very rarely.
Yeah, trickster clerics are a lot of fun. I think I feel like it's a question of when people want to play magical classes. This is just my interpretation, folks. I have no idea if this is true. When people want to play spellcasters, they choose spellcasters because they want to do the magical damage. Whoa, fireball, all that stuff.
Right.
But when you're playing a trickster cleric, it's not like you don't have access to some of those things. But what you're getting, the feed in to a trickster cleric is all the illusion spells and all the fun little things you can use to play tricks on people. It's not about high powered spells, or high damage anyway.
I mean, talking about things like pass without trace and disguise self and all that stuff. It's yeah.
I mean, it's almost like semi a support, but clerics in general are kind of built to be a support character. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
I mean, you was talking before about playing a group of elves, like everyone playing elves. I actually want to do a campaign. I don't know if I told you this. I want to call it Oathbound, and the players all play female elven paladins and clerics.
That's right.
Right. And they all, the characters are all bound together by oaths to basically they're on a mission to save the world.
Yeah.
And I think that would be really interesting and fun.
I think that would be real, especially as you mentioned, if they were all elves and doing this, then you've got all that history with the religion and everything that you can tie into, which is so
They all
cool.
come from the same order. They were all trained by the same people. They all come from a couple of different families that all know each other. They were raised together as children. They went to the same training institution. In my game, it would be the Daughters of Twilight, and they become, clerics or paladins of the Daughters of Twilight, and then they go off on a mission together. And all female as well. Be best if they were female players, but I'll take what I can get.
Right. Well, I'm a female player. I identify as a female player.
Excellent.
But I also want to mention before we end here that we didn't really talk too much about half elves, and partly because half elves are their own race in the player's handbook. Now, they're not going to be for long. With the update, half elves, half orcs, all that stuff goes away. So I'm kind of thinking maybe we're putting half elf on the shelf. That wasn't intended, but that's awesome. And
that's great.
And I think maybe we do like a half episode. I don't know what you like. We'll talk about the half elves, the half orcs.
Right.
I don't even know if we should because they were a thing and you can still play them. It's just that they won't actually be
mechanically a separate. Oh, my camera's frozen.
Yeah, your camera's frozen.
Let's see what's going on there. Good old Zoom. Are you being naughty? Zoom. Come on, Zoom. Don't be naughty. Sorry.
I think last time. No, that's fine. I think last time you fixed it with turning your camera off and then back on.
That's right. Let's try that. Turn it off and on again. Okay, and now boom. Here we go.
There we go. Half elf on the shelf just threw us for a loop. But I don't know. We'll have to workshop that and figure it out. But I think it deserves, an episode of talking about the half races, half species, and then how that's all going to change or not change in the future.
I did something really specific with half elves in my world. If you've got a minute,
sure.
So in Sidariel, there's the city Vanegate, and you have the Elven kingdoms a little way away, and they have this. The king of the Elven kingdoms has this private army called the Black Guard, and the Black Guard are nasty fuckers. They're like the SS. So they turn up at your door, you shit yourself. They're not very nice, for the most part, and they're mostly sort of paladins of whatever. Not going to get into that, but these knights, these Black Guard, have a lot to do with the nearby human lands, places like Vanegate, and thusly they tend to have a lot of illegitimate children because they live in these human lands. So there is this place called the Saunal Farms Enclave where they send their half-elven children as orphans. They don't know which family they're from. They don't know anything about their elven lineage really, except that they are half-elves. And they're trained to become spies for the Black Guard. And so you have these Saunal Farms Enclave half-elf spies that are sent out around the world, and they're all super well trained to be this thing. But they basically work for the Black Guard and for King Evran. They don't really know that that's what they do. I've outlined the whole training program, and I've got maps of the stuff.
Wow.
And it's quite fun.
That's cool. I think it's definitely going to be a good topic that we could talk about when we get to do half elves and half orcs and all that stuff. That's going to be fun.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right.
So
what else can elves?
Well, I was going to close it out until I said half elf on the shelf. And now I realize there's a whole nother elf, if we're looking at like, I mean, do they have elf on the shelf where you're at? Do you know what that is?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Okay. So because
that's why I laugh.
Right. I think that, I mean, it probably ties closer to like Santa's elves, but
right.
it's like more of a mischievous thing. It's more of, it's almost what I think of historically when people talk about gremlins. It's like they're just little trickster elves.
Right. I mean,
little fairies almost that
do
things around the house and leave you chocolates or something.
I think in real life, historically in real life, the word elf is almost synonymous with fae and fairy. They're kind of the same thing. And even when we're talking about dwarves last week, we found out that even in the Norse sagas, sometimes the elves and the dwarves were kind of interchangeable. And they had numerous different features. The main thing being that they were not human. They were alien. They were sort of a little bit celestial.
Very alien-like, yeah.
Yeah. Or even in the case of the dwarves, the word is chthonic, like from the underground. Chonic. Chthonic.
Wow.
That's a great word.
That is.
Lovecraft uses that word all the time.
Wow. I remember we were talking about the word elf, right? So the other thing that I found that was really interesting, I mean, there's all kinds of history stuff. And folks, if you really want to know about the history, it was a little dry to me, some of it, about like going back to Germanic folklore and Norse mythology. Let me rephrase because that sounded wrong. It wasn't dry. It's the way people presented in their YouTube videos or their material that I was researching. It was like scanning. Oh, there's a really interesting section. Okay, scanning. So anyway, I felt like maybe we didn't need to go through all of that. We're just giving you guys the highlights here. But the word elf, right? It actually kind of morphed over time, which I found really interesting. It was like Aelf, I think, before, pronounced Aelf and spelled that way. And it spawned all these names like, Aelfgar, Aelfin. It was really interesting. And I think because of all those like branches that went off, I also think that's why we have so many like diverse recollections or stories or, iterations of elves, because they just kind of like and like germinated like rabbit babies all over the world. And now there's all these different takes on elves.
they really, I mean, they easily, grab our imaginations, I think. Elves.
Yeah. But so the iteration of the word elf, the one that I found was really interesting was, the word oaf. You say you're like a clumsy oaf. Yeah. So that is actually a play on the word elf. That got because again, if you go through the history, folks, there's like so many stories about elves being these, kindly, fun, beings, magical and whimsy. But then there's this whole other side to it where there were, it was dark, it was bad luck, it was they stole your children away, it was all kinds of stuff.
Frog or something.
Yeah, and so oaf was kind of one of those words that kind of transformed from elf because it was seen as like a negative thing, and you're just horrible, and you're a clumsy oaf, and you have bad luck, and you trip over everything. So crazy how elf means so many things.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know too much about different cultures and how they interpret elves, but even here in New Zealand, there is a Maori myth about the elves that lived here before people.
Yeah.
They call them elves. I mean, there is a Maori name for it, but it's translated as elf. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah.
Suspect that there are a lot more stories in that regard, around the world of a sort of fae species of humanoid spirit folk.
Yeah.
It's very ephemeral.
I feel like maybe we need to start doing this and looking into our own cultures, because here's what I suspect with Filipino culture. We're very superstitious and everything is evil in some sense. I'm actually curious.
Catholics in the Philippines too,
right? Yeah. So I'm actually very curious what our version of elves would be in the Philippines, and I don't know. So I'm gonna have to look that up and report back on that. That's really cool.
Fascinating. Here's an interesting little tidbit I just discovered.
Yeah.
Elves can can sleep and dream just like, sorry for the bang, just like any human, but almost all surface elves avoid doing so. Dreams, as humans know them, are strange and confusing to elves. Unlike the actual memories of one's primal soul, present life or past lives, dreams are controlled products of the subconscious and perhaps the subconscious minds of those past lives or primal souls as well. An elf who dreams must always wonder whose mind these thoughts first arose from and why. Priests of Sehenin Moonbow are an exception. They sleep and dream to receive signs from their god, and elves consult such priests to interpret their own dreams.
Wow, that is really fascinating. And again, it makes so much sense. If you're so used to having a reverie and what you see in your trance-like state is real, and then you see something in your mind that's fictional, like that would be really disconcerting. Or, well, I mean, it wouldn't seem fictional. You would see something outlandish and think, well, this must be real somehow, somewhere, from someone.
I think that the difficulty in playing elves in D&D using this lore, especially with the reverie and stuff, the difficulty to me is how do you add those elements to your character? Like, how does that change the way you play your character? What are these visions? Who were you? Do you need to know those things? Does that affect the way you play your character? Were you just an elven peasant? Were you some elven champion? Do these things affect who you are now?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so those past lives I suppose as a DM, you could use a lot of that stuff to provide intuitions and seed ideas into the group through their reverie. You can use that as an opportunity to disclose information or even provide a path forward players if you needed to. But yeah, how to make that feel authentic and believable and what does it consist of? I tend to think of the reverie you're there going through great battles, remembering the time of Corellon, remembering these other planes of existence and great cities and history and stuff. But probably a lot of it would be quite mundane.
Yeah. You just have a memory of like sitting and having your morning cup of coffee and
having some tea, but sitting on a balcony in the woods. Remember that. But hey, that sort of thing. So how to make that interesting and useful, I think that's the challenge, and I find that to be the most interesting thing about the elves to me is like how do you do that?
Well, you know what it reminds me of is the Avatar, the
Aang?
Thank you. But I was trying to think of what it's not called Avatar.
The Last Airbender.
The Last Airbender. Thank you. That makes sense. But how he is kind of this reincarnated individual over and over and over again, but that it's not like he's an individual that has lived in different regions and different cultures, and so that I think is really interesting because then he can pull from his past lives, but they're giving him advice. They're
and he doesn't become those past life characters. He goes to a sort of demi-plane, if you like, and then communicates with them as if they were another person.
Right. So that's how I'm envisioning that, which is really, really cool.
I think that's really cool too. I very much agree with you there.
I think also as a player, if you were going to tap into this, you should write it into your backstory and have at least an idea of one or two of your past lives so that the DM can tap into that and it makes sense and it's not coming as a surprise that so-and-so is your backstory, and I'm going to go off on a little tangent here real quick. So I think, I don't remember what episode we just did recently where we talked about my real life job and how we go into the organizations and we talk about this and this, right?
It might have been last week, actually.
It might have been. But one of the exercises that we do with teams, right, to help build trust, we call it vulnerability-based trust, is whoever the team leader is, they tell about something in their childhood or their youth, their younger years, that was challenging for them, that they overcame, and how it shows up today, right? Like, you overcame this thing. What is your behavior pattern today that is caused by that thing that happened in your childhood? And the reason why we do that, and then everybody in the circle shares too, but the leader usually goes first. And the reason why we do that is because when you are having conflict with someone and you're just like so irritated, like, why do they do this thing? But if you understood that person just a little bit better, you knew about their background, then you are a little more understanding of their motivations and have a little bit more patience, right? Now, as a character who has past lives that you can tap into in this reverie, you could write into your backstory like maybe some personality hijinks, and it'll go back to such and such past life that you keep experiencing, or that like it's maybe there's some kind of a personality trait that sticks with you over the years, even though you're a different person. I don't know. It'd be really interesting to have something like that, that your behavior is because of something that happened to you way, 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 way back. You know?
And along those lines, I was also thinking from the point of view of the DM, and I may have to instigate this, where you can have a story arc that you're planning to do anyway, and then you can have a historical story that is revealed through the reverie that plays into and adds clues to and enriches the main story.
Right. The plot. Yeah.
The plot can be connected. And it may be that just at a crucial time when you're trying to find the clue, you take a long rest. Your elf has this reverie and goes, oh, that's where the secret door is.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily something as dumb and mundane as that, but
right.
preferably something really clever and interesting. But,
Yeah. So cool. I'm really glad you brought up this whole reverie. I think this is a really fascinating aspect to Elves that people should totally tap into.
Right. I mean, the sort of conflicts within Elves, and I'm just going to go through some of the headings here in the Modern Times book here. Some of the headings include things like, what do we got? Let's start at the top. The Elven diaspora, living in reverie, the childhood of elves, adolescence, adulthood, half elves, elder elves, and it goes into how the elder elves at a certain point, they start to undergo an experience kind of like the reverie. It's almost like they start slipping into the reverie unconsciously more and more often, a bit like humans getting Alzheimer's or something.
Right. I was just going to say, like a dementia.
Yeah, right. And they don't typically, what am I saying? They don't typically age outwardly much. Like they tend to age very, very slowly, and then all at once they get old.
Yeah.
At the end of their lives. There is another really, what were we doing? The cultural melancholy is an aspect. The long view talks about, how elves being long-lived, how they view the world from that perspective. So there's a whole little sub-chapter there. Crimes and punishment, passion versus restraint is an interesting kind of inner conflict with elves.
Yeah.
And they have this primeval hatred for the drow. And in my campaign, I'm not so much leaning into that personally.
Right.
And there's a bunch of reasons why elves might go adventuring. Elves and magic, wizardry, mythals, blade songs, the Seldarine, and then it gets into like the drow and so on. But I think some of those conflicts there are particularly interesting, especially like the long-lived sort of aspect and the sort of passion versus restraint.
Yeah.
Because elves, I think, are really restrained, but what is it that they're restraining? Why are they restraining it so hard?
Right.
Because they have so much passion. That's why, because if you let that passion out and then it's all.
When you have 600 years worth of life, that's a whole lot of passion to let loose. So
right. Exactly.
You got to rein it in.
That's just this life.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're reliving it over and over again when you have your trances. So.
Exactly. Cool.
I think that's a perfect note to end this episode, folks. So just rein in your 600 years long. I think got sidetracked, ADD or whatever. But there's a movie, I think, called something like 1,000 Years of Longing anyway, sorry. Not important, folks. I'll probably just put a little shoop, and this is the movie I was talking about right here. But anyway, all right, folks, we're going to end our episode on elves. Next time we get together to talk about the Player's Handbook races, we're going to be talking about halflings. So I'm excited to talk about that. Something different. I mean, dwarves and elves, those are like the two, I think, pillars of fantasy races. So now I think we're going to start getting into some different stuff here. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, until next time, folks, I'm just going to say goodbye, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Subscribe.